So I'm Tom TRYON. I'm the opinion editor of the Herald Tribune, and actually a Manatee County native. We have one other Manatee and one other Florida, right? So it's not too bad.
How do you count Florida? I've been here since I was 4.
4, you're almost. And actually, my one anecdote about the Myakka River. My maternal grandparents, who immigrated to the United States from Poland, actually operated Snookhaven from 1959 to 1964, which you can imagine in that era. Just imagine two people with very heavy Polish accents on the Myakka River. So, so that's my personal story. So let me introduce these folks really quickly. I could go on about their introductions, but won't. One of the good things about being in Sarasota is everybody understands that you need your reading glasses. So first is Charlie Hunsicker. He's director of Manatee County's Parks and Natural Resources Department. Has a BS degree from Wisconsin-Madison and a master's degree in urban and regional planning. He started his career in Manatee County 1977, and he now oversees 6 divisions that manage more than 30,000 acres of conservation and resource lands, and even has the joy of dealing with beach restoration. Charlie Hunsicker. Christine Johnson is a 5th-generation Floridian from Manatee County and shares the foundation's vision of creating an emerald necklace of pocket parks and protected lands along the Gulf Coast. She earned a degree from the College of Charleston and one from an MBA from the University of Florida. In 2001, October, she was named president of the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. Welcome. Third is Aliki Moncrief, who has a law degree from Harvard Law and a BA from Emory. She's worked for Earth Justice, Florida DEP, Florida Water and Land Legacy, and she helped gain approval of the Water and Land Conservation Amendment in 2004. Did anybody in this room vote against that amendment? That's what I thought. And she's now the executive director of the Florida Conservation Voters and FCV Education Fund. Welcome, Aliki. Finally, John Robinson, another Florida native, is manager of natural area parks, preserves, and trails for Sarasota County. Prior to that, he spent 28 years managing land for the Park Service, including 11 years managing Myakka River State Park. Welcome, John. So let's get started, everybody. I think we have about 40 minutes. We'll have an extended conversation, and then we'll have an exercise at the end, and we will end on time. So why preserve land? I don't think you need to convince anybody in this room of the need to and value of conserving land. But when you're talking to politicians and people who really aren't as passionate about preservation, what do you tell them in 30 seconds or less? Aliki, what's the cause?
Well, you know, I think it's important, even though we all believe in preserving land. I actually think most Floridians, even folks who live in urban cores and who maybe don't have the privilege of being able to paddle the Myakka or experience our incredible conservation lands, I think most people get it when you tie it to how important it is for our water supply in Florida. So I often think about conserving land as one of the best ways to protect water. Water being something that everyone cares about and everyone will take action on if you ask.
Charlie, I will note that I've, as a journalist, have covered, I won't say covered Charlie, but I've covered and watched Charlie Hunsicker since 1981. Mm-hmm. And nobody does more with less than this man right here. And he deserves credit for it. And I'm going to launch a campaign to get something named after him before he dies, whenever that might be. Charlie, what's the case that you make?
Well, that's a ways off. I like to talk. I had a county commissioner ask me several years ago when we were at 25,000 acres of conservation when is enough here? When you call to come to an end? And I like to think of it in terms of proportions. The Tampa Bay Estuary Program published, I thought, a wonderful mantra some years back that says restoring the balance of Tampa Bay. People who live out west, experience conservation lands federally owned in much larger proportions than we experience here in Florida. A lot of people talk about the law of thirds. 1/3 of lands to hold us where we live, where we work, where we worship. 1/3 of the lands to grow our food, and 1/3 of the lands for conservation. We've never reached that percentage here in Florida because we've had land grants going way back to the Spanish Crown. But I like to talk about the fact that for me, someone said you've never seen a conservation property you could not dislike. And I think with so much growth in Florida, we can do only the best job to acquire as much as the public will allow. The public being those who will support us in referendums, support by talking to our county elected officials and state elected officials, because we, as part of a timeline, I'm going off and I'm sorry. No, but we have this spot along a timeline. We have generations to our past and generations to come, and a duty to those generations to do right, so that 3 generations from now they'll look back and say, yeah, they did okay when they're looking at aerial photos of Florida from 2000. So anyway, I'd talk about it in terms of percentages and comfort. As long as the people who are supporting it, we should try to do as much as we can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Charlie. Christine?
When Conservation Foundation talks to elected officials, we talk about 3 things. The first being the one that Aliki mentioned, which is water, drinkable, fishable, swimmable water. Number 2, we find in political circles, when's enough? To Charlie's point, I was just getting my stats right, so I'm going to gloss over it a little bit. John Thaxton gave it to me before, and I asked him again, when's enough? How about flipping it around? When's enough development is enough? His statistic that he did way back in the early aughts of this century, which was only about 10 years ago, said that if we develop everything that's in our strategic plan right now, in our comprehensive plan for Sarasota County, the biggest number would be we'd be 1 million people, and right now we're 400,000. Is that enough? Is that enough? So flip that around when you're talking to your elected officials. And the third thing is, why do we all live here? It's not because of the weather. If that's the case, we'd live in Miami, it has better weather. If that was the case, it would be LA, California, it has better weather. We live here in this region because of the beauty. And that is the goose that laid the golden egg. So why would we want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg? And those are the 3 things that we talk about with elected officials.
John?
I can tell you it's going to be fun sitting at this end of the couch if we keep going this order, because each of them took all of my answers. I think the answer that I go with the most is how much is enough or how much is too much is an ongoing question. Charlie mentioned the rule of thirds. In Sarasota County, we have protected about 1/3 of the property. And I think the answer, they say, isn't 1/3 enough? I said, well, if we stop growing the population, putting pressure on those natural areas, 1/3 might be enough. But I don't think we're going to stop growing that population anytime soon.
Okay, so you get a unique question. What was it like to manage Mac River State Park?
I loved your introduction of Charlie as to how much he does with so little. In the state park system, we had a saying for many, many years that we've done so much with so little for so long, we're doing everything with nothing. And it certainly felt like that. Mayaca was a rare privilege. I camped there with my family for the first time in 1966. And at that time, obviously, had no idea I'd be going back to manage that property at some point. At the same time, it was a major challenge to live and work in the footsteps of the giants that had been there before me, not only the previous park management, but the team that managed that property. I say that it was the biggest, most complicated park that I ever managed, but the easiest job I ever had because of the people that I had around me.
Why was it complicated?
You've got 2 of everything. Most parks barely have 1 of everything. You have 2 gates, 2 concessions. At the time, 2 campgrounds. It's grown to 3. We are handling anywhere, depending on how much of the season is flooded, 200 to 400,000 visitors a year. You have barely enough staff to handle the people issues and then add in the resource management issues. If you don't take care of the resource management, the people are going to stop coming. So finding that balance on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Charlie, you have the pleasure and sometimes challenge of managing Duet Park. So tell us a little bit about that, and I think particularly that's a multi-use park that involves hunting. So talk a little bit about that, about the uniqueness of that property. And I think it is unique in this region.
Well, it starts as a principal part of the watershed of Lake Manatee. And during the campaign of the 80s, 84 and 86, when we went to referendum to acquire those properties, it was to protect the drinking water. It wasn't to keep out farming. It wasn't to keep out changes that were happening over the landscape. It was really driven to put a stop to phosphate mining in that watershed. And that was successful by acquisition. That's principally the only thing we had left, the only tool we had left after we saw regulatory agencies moving in the direction of permitting clay storage areas and mining, excavation, all through the drinking water watershed. It was going to be a nightmare for us, I thought. But so at the time, the protection was watershed. But then the people who participated in the referendum became a loud voice. The people like Eddie Chance and others who, and Chick Parker led the cause to open the land up to the conservation uses that are typical. At the time, it was cattle, and it was hunting. And a lot of legacy and heritage hunting had taken place there. So we embraced that and wanted to move forward with a prescribed hunting program, working in concert with land restoration, so that we could manage the game that was there without it deprivation of deer populations by overpopulation and all the reasons you might hear in a hunting situation. But for us, it's worked out very well because our hunting experience over the 18 or 20 years that we've had the program has steadily grown with hunters who are conservationists in and of themselves. We have good weight distribution for the deer that are taken. We have a limit, of course, not more than $60 a year tops. But what I'm trying to get to is that the hunting as part of the land management tool of the property was embraced by our citizens, and we wanted to keep that opportunity available as we acquired the property.
Good, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about, many in this room would like to preserve as much land as possible, but everyone all of y'all face challenges with resources. So Aliki, why don't you start? How do you prioritize preservation and acquisition?
Well, I mean, I have the good fortune of working as Florida conservation voters to really try to elevate land conservation as a priority issue for lawmakers because we know it's a priority value for Floridians and Florida voters. So from my organization standpoint, my job is to trust the great people at the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast and other organizations and sort of get what their assessment of the important buys are to the attention of lawmakers. So I'm actually not the best person to ask about how do you choose land. I'm agnostic. If Christine says, or if our friends at Trust for Public Land, or if they say these are important lands, then I'm on a mission to make sure that lawmakers pay attention to that.
Okay, I'll ask you a different question. Why aren't they paying attention in the views of many Floridians, especially those who voted for Amendment 1 in 2014?
Right.
It was pretty clear, we thought, what should and would happen.
Yes.
So why is it not happening?
Well, starting in 2009, 2010, if you look at the total environmental spending of our state, while our state budget has grown in all of those years except for one, our environmental budget has not. Our environmental budget actually has been on the decline in most of those years. And so when you ask the question why not, not to be oversimplistic, but they don't want to spend the money that way. They don't want to grow the budget. They would rather spend money on tax breaks. They simply don't want to spend the money that way. And oftentimes what you'll find in Tallahassee is that there's always a new crisis that comes up, which is we're a big state. We have a lot of complicated issues. One crisis this year is a housing crisis because of a large influx of climate refugees from Puerto Rico. And so those are the types of things that happen every year and that lawmakers, unfortunately, will point to and say, oh, well, we've got this emergency situation right now that we have to spend money on. So land conservation is going to have to wait. That's a nice to have, not a need to have. So we're trying to change that dynamic. And I think, if I could sort of sum it all up, it's a lack of political will And I could go on and on about how we changed that, but I'll limit my answer to why. It's because they don't have the will.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So on the prioritization issue, Charlie, why don't you lead off there? How do you, in your mind, prioritize, and how do you present those priorities?
Well, from a management standpoint, a management challenge with limited resources, we try to prioritize acquisitions that are adjacent to existing publicly held lands, so that it's much easier for us to simply expand our territory from a home base than it is to travel to different locations, populated throughout the county. So that's our first goal, is to expand on what we have when we prioritize. We also follow the mantra that water is very, very important, and connectivity to our rivers and streams, and by virtue of that, you get connectivity for your wildlife corridors. And so, but there's still an extreme value to sand pine, and the sand scrub uplands. So, how do you prioritize it? You throw a dart in the map of Manatee County, and you say that's a good spot, because there's so much there that has independent and yet connectivity that you can't go in a far difficult decision, different direction if you don't take action to protect the habitats of water, habitat, connectivity, and again, principally in primary, willing seller support. No acquisition programs that I know of use the heavy hand of condemnation, and of course, so we work with willing sellers and try to educate those sellers on the estate values, the legacy values, and the tax values of working with local governments and foundations to make their land available. But they're willing sellers all the way along.
And unlike Sarasota County, Manatee does not have a dedicated acquisition revenue source.
That's true. We actually never had.
Yeah. All right.
We tried.
We tried.
Yes.
Christine, prioritization, and particularly from a foundation, private sector standpoint.
Sure. About 5 years ago, we went out to the communities that we serve in 4 different counties and asked not only our donors, but as well elected officials, public officials, municipalities, and a big broad range. And we did a big listening session up and down the 4 counties from Manatee, Sarasota, Charlotte, and Lee, and said, what do you want us to protect? And we're going to put that into our strategic plan. And so we created over 30 different criteria, but they really all roll up into 4. And the first one is, we want you to save land adjacent to water. We said fresh or salt, and they said yes. They said that's what's going the fastest. Our drinking water is very important to us, but the land adjacent to water is going away and being gobbled up, and we are losing our access to it the fastest, number 1. Number 2, they said save rare endangered species and habitat. And that's where most of that over 30 different criteria comes from. What is that? And so, but it's rare and endangered species. Dry prairie is one. Third, they said connect up, to Charlie's point. Holes in the donuts, of protected lands, or if there is a linkage that you can make between, for instance, Babcock Ranch down in Charlotte County and Myakka Island, that whole big green blob that you saw on the map earlier, if you can connect those up, that's great. That's not only great for people, but as well for animals and plants. And then finally, they said, we do want public access. We don't need to get on everything, on all the land that you can serve. But if you do, don't duplicate efforts of something just a mile or 2 down the road, because it's expensive. And we are funded, of course, from the community. We're funded from philanthropists that give $25 as well as $250,000. So we don't want you to spend money on public access that is duplicative of something just down the road.
Okay. So one follow-up question. So your foundation's work, who ends up owning the property?
Every project is different, but in 3 different buckets. The landowner could own the land, and we own the conservation easement, which is the rights of development rights and other rights that would protect it from being changed in the future forever. So we own the conservation easement, landowner owns the land. Another one is we own it all. The legal term is we own it in fee. That's our headquarters, for instance, or our Pine Island Preserve. And then the third one is we facilitate the transaction to conserve the property. And we bring different parties together, you'll hear a little bit later from Elizabeth Moore on Triangle Ranch. We facilitated that project whereby the conservation easement is owned by the Water District and Elizabeth Moore owns the dirt, if you will, of the property.
Good. So John, as we mentioned with Charlie, you have a somewhat different advantage.
We have a very different model.
Yeah, with a dedicated source. So talk a little bit about what that enables you to do, but also how you prioritize acquisitions.
Well, just like our model was funded by a choice of the citizens, our acquisition is funded by a choice of the citizens. In our case, it's an Environmentally Sensitive Lands Oversight Committee that works with the willing sellers that Charlie mentioned that have their properties nominated, and then those properties are reviewed by that Citizens Advisory Board that reviews them based on a criteria, much like Christine was talking about, and presents their recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners, and then budgets matching, we go after those for acquisition. And that's been a really positive model that's worked very well in Sarasota County. It goes back to my mentioning that between the state and the county lands, over a third of the county is protected. We've got natural areas that go from US 41 down in Northport to the Manatee County line that encompass over 100,000 acres. If you include conservation easements, includes 120,000 acres that are only bisected by 2 roads in that entire process, and that's I-75 and State Road 72. So when you look at a landmass that size, and that's the joint thought process of the citizens of the state with Myakka River State Park, early in the 1980s acquisition of the Carlton Reserve for water conservation, drinking water, and then the future citizens for protecting these lands for conservation. So
Charlie had mentioned willing seller, and I remember, many of us in this room remember the outfall when John Thaxton and John and those folks started drawing up or map some pieces of property that might be wanted, and the property owners freaked out and said, oh, you're going to come after my property, you're going to come after my property. So how do you hook up with willing sellers? How does that work?
It's really, really an interesting dynamic process. We call them on the phone. When a property gets nominated, and at times it gets nominated by somebody who's not the owner of the property. Somebody drives by and looks at this or looks at a map and says, hey, this would be great for conservation. We reach out to them, primarily because of what you talked about in the early days of that program. Some great maps were drawn and put out into the public eye before all the landowners were talked to. So in order to avoid that in the future, we're very cautious about identifying properties until they're a willing seller. But after that, it's just a conversation. It's talking to your neighbors and finding out if they're interested in participating.
So are there criteria for purchase?
There is. That's established and decided by the citizens through the advisory council, and as much as mentioned as by the other panelists, it's access to water and water connectivity. It's access to our existing lands. It's supporting endangered species. Right now, we're looking at smaller properties that will help to serve the scrub jay population. We're finding, and I'm sure you'll hear about scrub jays later, but we're finding the scrub jay populations are being very isolated by where there's scrub habitat, and therefore they're not being able to mix between the different populations. Inbreeding is not good for any species. So we're looking for opportunities to maybe promote that.
So Christine, when is the foundation most helpful? What can the foundation do that perhaps sometimes the governments cannot do or won't do?
Both, actually, yes. And in fact, at Sarasota County, we acted as their agent. And the reason why Conservation Foundation was contracted, for 6 or 7 years as the purchasing agent for Sarasota County was exactly what you're asking. We can have conversations and things with landowners that the government cannot have until it goes before the county commission. And so, just like with any other transaction, specifically real estate, you really don't want to be negotiating those things out in the public. You really don't want to be negotiating those in the sunshine. That's never puts the county in the best position to get the best for their money. So that's one way. Another way is that we can utilize our charitable donors and their wealth and philanthropy, their love of their fellow men, more so than government agencies can.
Okay, thank you. So let's kind of shift around a little bit and talk about we talked about prioritization, but priorities. We'll start with John. What do you see? What property do you just really, really, really want? Not for yourself.
You know, if you're asking John, county employee working on this program, which I'm representing up here, the property we've been talking about for in my case, for the last few years, in some cases back to the early 2000s, is Orange Hammock. That's the one that's on everybody's lips as probably the last large, sizable piece of property that's going to be attainable. There's some others that we're talking about with conservation easements that would protect those lands, but Orange Hammock is the one that's the top of everybody's mind.
Because?
Like I said, it's the last large tract. It's got a lot of dry prairie in it. It's got a lot of water resources that are supporting the city of Northport. There's a lot of reasons for it. And it'll also connect through conservation easements to those other properties that I've already identified.
Right. And I understand the Water Authority has agreed to do mitigation and contribute to purchase price and do mitigation and those kinds of things. Christine, we talked a little bit about the difficulties of getting these things done. Let's cut to the chase. Why has this been so difficult?
Why is Orange Hammock?
Acquisition of Orange Hammock.
I'm glad he asked you.
Historically, I believe you can put it to a misunderstanding of what is Orange Hammock Ranch by political as well as influencers. Number one, there's a misunderstanding that when you look at a map that you think it's land and it's land, and that it's developable land. When you go out to Orange Hammock Ranch from about late May to early October, the whole thing's underwater about like this. Sheet flow flows off of this into the man-made Snover waterway that provides the drinking water for the city of Northport. And yet when people who don't understand the ecology and the environment of Florida see a map, they say, well, that's land. Why can't it be developed? So that's number one. Number two, there's been a contingency in the city of Northport for desire to develop everything that they can and grow the city of Northport for growth's sake and for revenue's sake. Again, not understanding that they have to first have a there. They need a downtown area, but they are uniquely positioned to be the environmental tourism city in the state of Florida. They are surrounded on 3 sides by protected lands, and they're the only city that has a state forest in its city boundaries. So they could create a there, create a downtown, have some hotels, and do some enormous environmental ecotourism as well as environmental tourism if they can just get that political will. And then probably the third thing is on a statewide level, and perhaps even with the water districts, there are appointed board members at the water districts, and there are elected officials in Tallahassee who have that mentality, unlike everyone here, and unlike the 75% of voters in 2014 that said, we want this done, we want to spend our money this way. There's a political agenda, if you will, that says we have enough and we don't need any more.
Okay. So Charlie, back to you, the piece that you would just die to have. Not die yet, because we still have to name this place after you. But you would die somewhere in the future if you can't get.
Well, no, it's as many fingers and toes as I can count, because across Manatee County's domain there is all types of upland and coastal habitat opportunities that we need to interject ourselves into as a public body to protect the essential features of those. But I would say, you know, in the molecular, and it's conditioned by the degree of threat. My choices are conditioned by a degree of, in other words, the urgency of acquisition. If a change is coming, it's conditioned by what type of stewardship the current owners are holding, the families holding for the property, and maybe the rarity of it all. So in eastern Manatee County, along the coast, we have the unique opportunities to have protected some of our finest coastlines. Driving south from Pinellas County, coming into Manatee County, you see an undeveloped coastline. And the Rattlesnake Key area and other locations up in Sarasota are still threatened with development. And I think in order to preserve and maintain that beautiful view that we've been able to grab hold of with some significant acquisitions from Emerson Point up to Port Manatee, that's where we should focus our efforts on eastern Manatee County. In western Manatee County, there's some very valuable and wonderful habitats tributary to the Mica River. But I believe there, we're finding that the landowners still have a wonderful sense, powerful sense of conservation and stewardship among themselves. The Blackbeard Ranch just went through an easement process to protect a substantial portion of the upper Mica River. And some of the landowners that are there still hold those values true. So as long as they're doing their family philosophies are solid, that's fine. So I think our focus in the county needs to continue to protect these unique view sheds from the water. We were able to capture a good view south of Manatee Avenue coming in from the island, the so-called Neo Preserve. We lost the land to the north. The Cortez fishing community there will give us a long-term protection of that waterfront view coming from State Road 70, Cortez Road. We need to continue to focus, I think, coming across I-275 from the Skyway and do whatever we can in partnership with the state. The Florida Forever program prioritized many of those properties, including Rattlesnake Key, for acquisition, and we should not give up. We should not be deterred from keeping an eye on those properties to protect them as well.
Okay, good, thanks. So Aliki, I said that we would come back to you on the question of what can the people in this room do realistically to try to influence legislators on Amendment 1 and on preservation acquisition in general.
Well, I like that you qualified it with realistically, because it is going to be different for everyone. There's a lot of different items on the menu, and people can pick and choose different things. I kind of have a question. I'm curious how many people in the room vote consistently in every election. Okay, so you got the baseline. As you know, we've been talking about today, voting is important, but it's not enough. And so in terms of what folks in the room can do, how many folks in the room volunteer to help a candidate who they believe in when they are running for election? Okay, that's a good number, not as many as voting. How many give financial contributions to candidates who they believe in, who they think are going to speak their values? That's great, that's a little bit more. So you all are on track. You are doing the things that we all need to do, and that importantly, we need to get more people to do, because we're kind of the choir here. And I think one of the things that I would impart to everybody is to break outside of your bubble. We're in this really cozy bubble, and we all agree for the most part. I mean, we'll argue over some details and whatnot. But really, I would impart to everybody that one of the most important things they can do is to break outside their bubble and bring more voters into our circle of people who care and people who take action. And in Florida, in many places, one of the easiest places to look for those voters is actually in communities of color. And I'm not going to get too wonky with everybody, but when you look at populations across the state, there's what they call kind of a voting gap. What's the percentage of our state who is African American, and what's the percentage of African Americans who vote versus, white voters or white Floridians versus white voters? There are bigger gaps in communities of color, and so I would impart to everybody here that one of the best ways that we can get more conservation leaders elected to office is to actually work with communities of color more robustly. And the reason I say that, it's actually supported by a little bit of data. As you mentioned, I worked on the Amendment 1 campaign, the Water and Land Conservation Amendment, and one of the things that we haven't talked about a lot, when you actually break down the votes on that amendment, you might be surprised at who were the strongest supporters. When you break it down to the precinct level, and you look at precincts that were 80% white or Latino, African American or Latino, their range of support was like 50 to 75%, whereas in white precincts, it was as low as 30 and only tapped out at 65. So the strongest block of opposition to the amendment was actually suburban white voters along the I-4 corridor. And some of the strongest supporters of the Water and Land Conservation Amendment were African American precincts, whether they were in cities or whether they were in rural areas. In fact, party was the least helpful indicator. Like Democrats, Republicans, that you can't make any assumptions on that criterion. But when you look at geography and when you look at things like race, you could actually start to parse out some differences. So I know that was a little longer than maybe you wanted, but I would say that that's one of the most important things that folks in the room could do.
Yeah, that's interesting because, and this is just anecdotal, but one of the most diversified locations that I know of is Emerson Point Park.
That's right.
And when I think, you know, other than schools, if you go to parks, by and large, you know, the larger regional parks, they're among the most diversified places I think we find. And so that's a very interesting point because for many of those people that the public lands are their only access in many cases.
Well, public lands bring people together. They belong to all of us. And it's whether you're talking about community parks or even state parks. I mean, you go to the picnic areas in state parks, you're going to see a lot more diversity there than you might expect. So, yeah.
I do have to throw this in about Emerson Point because I'm going to give myself credit. I actually wrote the first story that a condominium was being erected at the end of Emerson Point. They had done the footers, and there was wrought iron in the ground, and the view from DeSoto National Park was going to be ruined, and that was the beginning of a huge, long campaign. I never actually figured out how they pulled the permits for that condominium, and Charlie probably doesn't want to know, and I don't want to know. But, and it was one of the best demonstrations of public, not just opposition to the project, but then subsequent public support. Busloads of people going to Tallahassee, literally busloads going to Tallahassee to lobby the legislature and one of the boards. And it's an incredible story, and it's almost like one of those, you know, it almost did not get preserved kind of situations.
Tom, could I make a remark if you can turn my mic on? Now, see, this is a throwback to you, Tom, and the others in your profession. I've often talked to journalists with a great degree of respect that I can only speak to 100 people, 200 people, one person. And when you, in the journalism profession, whether now it's media or print, you have the opportunity to speak to thousands, and especially in your role now in the editorial side of the affairs, to be able to shape public opinion. You truly are, and your colleagues in the other newspaper outlets are in a position to help shape that public opinion by drawing in the facts as you know them, and the goodness of those facts as you can express them. And we owe a debt of gratitude to you and your profession to continue to put the word out to folks outside of our circle of friends. And I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you. The size of the name on that place just got bigger, Charlie.
Well, I have to do a full disclosure here, too, for the audience. Emerson Point is is at the end of Palmetto, if you were to go out to Palmetto and then make a left going west. And Tom and I grew up in Palmetto, and Emerson Point was seen as a public land long before it was a public land. And when I was sharing some of the high school stories with Charlie about this, he said, yeah, those were your beer cans that we cleaned up. Because it was the place to go in high school, you know, when you weren't supposed to go. And I think as well, what we're trying to do with Conservation Foundation and what everybody else is up here trying to do, and I'm sure you're here trying to do too, is to create a community of conservation. We call it a conservation community that we are trying to develop here. And I think that is a wonderful story of a community conservation effort. And I just want to say thank you to Tom as well, and to Charlie, and tell everybody else that it was a place that everybody cared about because it's where we got to go even though it wasn't public.
And you still
My family reunion was there last weekend.
And back then you had to want to drink beer really badly because those sand gnats, they would carry people away. I mean, it was like the procession out.
Quick into dates.
Yeah. Okay, let's, I think we're going to have some housekeeping in a few minutes. So let's just kind of let you each give a closing statement or reiterate something or bring up something that we didn't cover. So we'll start with you, John.
One of the things I was hoping we'd talk a little bit more about that we didn't talk about is the maintenance of our public lands. What do we do after we acquire them? And I was thinking about that, and the best way I could think about it is, how many people own or ever owned a home, own their own home? Do you all remember the excitement when you bought that home, how excited you were? Do you remember how excited you were when you had to put a new roof on it? Or when you had to go mow the grass? You have to remember that once we take the major step to acquire these beautiful, special places that we have an emotional connection to, that we have to take care of them in perpetuity. And I think we're going to be looking at some choices coming up. This part of this conversation was billed as we're the last generation to be able to save these lands. But every generation after us is going to have to figure out how to take care of them. And we're going to have to figure out how to get that messaging past the excitement of acquiring these lands and build that emotional connection to maintaining those lands.
So you got any ideas for how we do that?
I think it's that emotional connection, and I think we'll be testing it here in Sarasota, and when our referendum that we're using to acquire lands, also through the foresight of people, is helping us maintain those lands, and that sunsets in 2029. From a land management standpoint, that's not that far off. So we'll be addressing that in the very short future.
Okay, good. Christine?
I'd like to invite you all to be our guests. Out there on the table for lands, you'll find this little card. It's actually an invitation. We are bringing the author Andrea Wolf, who wrote The Invention of Nature, which is all about Alexander Humboldt and how he really created the whole concept that we have of nature. She is going to be here at the Opera House in Sarasota on May 8th. It's also being sponsored as well by Elizabeth Moore, and we join with the Ringling College Library Association. It's in the afternoon. All you need to do is look on the back, and you'll see the phone number where you can RSVP and be our guest to attend.
Okay, good. Thank you. Charlie?
Well, I'd like to offer a challenge to each of you, because this is part of a choir. Many of us are conductors, many of us are choirs, many of us are participants in choirs, but there are other choirs out there. There are other people who are concerned about transportation morbidly, and there are other people who are concerned about other things other than conservation. So I compel each of us here to speak with passion to the other choirs, because learning never stops, to speak with wisdom, and then to hold on to reason. Because it's difficult from time to time to find middle ground, and those who assert reason and rationale can find that middle ground to bring other choirs in. And whether it starts at our neighbors or our local political leaders or our state political leaders or our national political leaders, to have that dialogue with passion, wisdom, and reason.
Yeah, we could do that in a lot of realms right now, couldn't we? But thank you, Charlie. Aliki?
Yeah. I guess I would invite everybody to step up their game, wherever you're at. If you're voting consistently, but you're not getting involved in elections otherwise, and it doesn't have to be money. It could be joining a phone bank to talk to other voters. Whatever you do, like take a look inside and think about, well, how am I engaged in my democracy, and how am I making sure that our elected officials, that your elected official is representing your will, and just step it up a notch. One of the things I guess I also wanted to mention, I think a lot of times people feel pessimistic if they live in a district where it's really swayed one way or the other, and it looks like there's a chosen one. You know, it's the whatever the party is. This is the person who has the most of that party in that district, and they've got the party blessing, and so, gosh, it's hopeless in my district. One, I think that we have to start to bring back the balance, and so by stepping up your game, that helps us bring back the balance in the districts. And the other is, if you're impatient, like me, and you want to see change a little bit more quickly, don't just think within your own political district boundaries. There may be a legislative district that you can help influence that's not your own, but that could really use your help. We've had a lot of volunteers who, live in an area where they're like, well, gosh, my elected official is great, but she is one of many, and so what can I do? Well, you can help us get someone elected in, Alachua County or Duval County or what have you. So step up your game, at least this year, and then see how you like it, and then do it again in 2019, and then do it again in 2020.
All right. Well, on that note, Christine, I mean, is there anything that folks in this room can do to help facilitate, push forward the oak hammock purchase? Orange hammock, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Orange Hammock Ranch. Yes, if you live in Sarasota County, I would highly recommend that you give your commissioners a call, send them an email, let them know. But I would also say, just to Aliki's point as well, think beyond that. And more importantly, find out who your county board member is on SwiftMud. For Manatee County, it's John Henslick. And for Sarasota County, it's...
Mike Moran?
No. It was Mike Moran. Schleicher is brand new. Joel Schleicher. And send him an email and let him know that this is something very important to you, to our environment, to our... It's also important... They do not get this. They do not get that it is important to our tourism industry. And it totally is. So it's not just about the birds and the trees and the waters and be seen as, that environmentalist calling me again. It's also really important to our ability to grow. You cannot grow a community without water. And furthermore, you cannot have a growth in a community if they don't have a there. And that's so important to Northport. So those two things, county commissioner and water district board member.
All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's my charge to read these questions?
They'll come up on the screen.
Okay, they'll come up on the screen. All right. So are we ready to put questions for the audience up on the screen? All right. What is your favorite park preserve? So you folks know what to do?
Yeah.
Good.
They just have two choices?
They get to put whatever, and it's one of those wordles.
No, they've got two choices up there, though.
No, it's a wordle.
Okay, now
All right, here we go.
They can put whatever.
Oh, those are people adding. Gotcha.
So while that's up there, is the Celery Fields a park?
The Celery Fields is a regional stormwater facility with park amenities.
Okay.
Tell you what, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck,
Yeah.
it's a duck.
And it depends on who you're talking to, right?
Well, for us, the important thing is that if we called it a park, we would probably end up funding it as a park. And if it's a regional stormwater facility, there's other funding sources that help us maintain and manage it and take care of it.
Okay. That good? All right. Next question. Which is more important? Preservation or public access?
That tells us who our audience is today.
But it also tells us they're not thinking far enough ahead. Because if we can't get the public on there and get that emotional connection, we're not going to be able to preserve it.
All right, I think it's stabilizing here. Third question, please, for the audience. Do you trust your government or private land? Christine, you loaded this question. Do you trust your government or private land trust more to?
Which is what?
Choose the right properties to conserve, keep conservation lands protected forever. Oh, this is government.
Government on one side and private on the other.
All right, so what about the other side?
Private land trust.
Private land trust? You didn't stack the deck, Christine.
You want to explain this one?
I think it's trending to the right.
Oh, okay.
As opposed to the,
All right.
very strongly trending to the right.
Okay, and number 4, last but not least, what do you believe is the biggest threat to the future of Florida's conservation lands? It is multiple choice.
Very good.
One.
Aliki, this is looking good for your organization.
Yeah.
Lack of conservation leaders in public lands.
But can't
Public
do much
office,
about
sorry.
that.
Yeah.
That's like
Okay, so moderator's pleasure here. How many say all of the above? Okay. All right. Have I done my duty? Good, thank you. Thank you for your attention, everybody. Thank you to the panelists. It's been good. Thank you very much.